Good evening, everyone. Welcome. It's Constitution Day. Somebody asked me on the way in, where did that come from, if you'd like to know. We started celebrating this, just a little after 2004, when Senator Byrd got it put on an omnibus spending bill to make sure that all publicly funded education institutions celebrate Constitution Day. So, as our speaker and I just conversed, that's an unfunded mandate that we are happy to accept, actually. This is one of my favorite holidays at the university. We should be taking a moment every year to think about this whole enterprise we call the United States of America, and what better way to get started on that thinking than with Constitution Day. As I was thinking about tonight's conversation, though, I thought it would be interesting to think a little bit more about the intersection between education and journalism. And I looked at our core values. You know, we have 6, I believe, but 3 are particularly relevant at this moment. The first one is dialogue. At Western Connecticut State University, we value the conversations that explore diverse perspectives and encourage shared understanding. I think any journalist would agree that we have a similar goal. We're not putting forward one idea and one set of concepts. We are exploring together. We are trying to find shared meaning. And this, I think, is right and proper when we think about the functions of our government, as much as it is right and proper when we think about how DNA works. This is what we do at a university. A second important value is engagement. We value the interactions with ideas, peers, and community that are essential to a vibrant university environment. This, too, reminds us that we should be talking to each other, and not with just one small select group, but with everybody around us. A university is a unique opportunity to bring together people from diverse backgrounds and from the greater community to come and talk about these ideas. Journalists, likewise, reach out beyond the borders of a small circle of people, making sure they're engaging with multiple perspectives and multiple communities and multiple constituencies to get to the heart of important questions that they want to bring to all of us, their consumer. Finally, respect. We value the right of all people to be treated with dignity and fairness, and expect this in our policies, classrooms, and community. This is a core value of Western Connecticut State University, and I think it's inherent in the very notion of celebrating and guaranteeing the rights for a free press in this country. Our goal is to make sure that our policies and our people are respected across all constituencies and across all needs. So I believe that journalism and education are sisters. We come together with a shared goal. And when I think of the start of the Constitution, I think, they wrote these great words about how the government would function, and then they said, okay, and then we'll figure it out in post, right? That's just for you, JC. But really, what then happened was we put in place these important institutions to help us figure it out, and to help us live through and follow those goals and those lofty ideas that were put forth with the signing of the Constitution. So I think it's right and proper that we celebrate today, and I am looking forward to the conversation ahead. But now I'd like to introduce Dean Michelle Brown, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Provost Alexander, and welcome here tonight. Thank you all for showing up and coming. We're very excited to introduce the speaker tonight. But before I do so, I'd like to just say thanks to a couple of folks and tell you a little bit about Stephen Engelberg and his career. So Stephen Engelberg is the editor-in-chief of ProPublica, which is an independent, nonprofit, investigative news team that exposes corruption and abuses of power. And their aim is to benefit society. They cover practically every topic that is a major in the School of Arts and Sciences, so it's exceptionally prescient that we're here tonight. ProPublica is the winner of 2 Emmys, 3 Peabody Awards, 4 Pulitzer Prizes, 5 George Polk Awards, and 6 MacArthur Foundation Awards. Mr. Engelberg's numerous awards and credentials include 2 Polk Awards himself, nearly 20 years of reporting for the New York Times, managing editor of the Oregonian, and author of the book Germs, Biological Weapons and America's Secret War. So even Mr. Engelberg's own career spans coverage in a variety of topics that are of relevance to us here. And we want to thank Mr. Engelberg for spending generously of his time today. He's been interviewed by our students for Election Connection. He's participated in moderated discussions with classes, and he even had coffee with the faculty. So we've all had the opportunity to mingle and learn from and talk with Mr. Engelberg. I also want to thank a number of organizations on campus that have participated in hosting, facilitating, and planning the events today. Communication and Media Arts, Computer Science, English, Mathematics, Writing, Linguistics, and Creative Processes, Political Science, Psychology, Social Sciences, Philosophy, and History. And I would like to please, if everyone could please give a round of applause to Marcy May for planning this event. And to Michael and Elizabeth Nolan for hosting our speaker, please. Thank you. The Haas Library also has contributed, and I also want to send a special thank you to Provost Missy Alexander. She was just standing here a moment ago for promoting the discussion among multiple perspectives on and off campus, and for also moderating with journalism professor John Roche after the session. So if you want to stay after the speech, there'll be some Q&A as well. And that's all I have to say. So now, without further ado, if you'll please welcome Stephen Engelberg.
Good evening. Good evening. It's my great pleasure to be here tonight. I'd like to thank Provost Alexander, Dean Brown, Marcy May, and last but not least, Professor Michael Nolan, who in addition to being a wonderful scholar in all things German, happens to be my brother-in-law. It does seem a particularly relevant moment to be thinking about our Constitution. And since I'm a member in good standing of the fraternity our president has dubbed an enemy of the people, I thought I would try to give you a little bit of perspective on it. And also, just to remind us, because the events go so quickly, of sort of what's been up lately. So I did go back to sort of look at the question of what has our president been saying to his 54 million followers on Twitter on this subject. And I picked up a couple of choice words. He said the other day first, and I can't give you the all caps, so I'll try to raise my voice. The fake news hates me saying that they are the enemy of the people, only because they know it's true. I am providing a great service by explaining this to the American people. They purposely cause great division and distrust. They can also cause war. They are very dangerous and sick. And then, of course, a few weeks ago, there was this. Very little discussion of all the purposely false and defamatory stories put out this week by the fake news media. They are out of control. Correct reporting means nothing to them. Major lies written, then forced to be withdrawn after they exposed a stain on America. Thanks. So I welcome the opportunity to speak with you today because, frankly, it has offered me a chance to step back from the literally hourly craziness and reflect a bit on what has gone on over the last 20 months. Given the pace of events, the new normal, which let's remember is not normal at all, has allowed for startling little reflection by any of us. We have fallen into a pattern in which the president and his accolades attempt to own each news cycle, and those news cycles seem to last about 2 hours, by making a statement so outrageous and often so at odds with the truth that it dominates the day's political and media conversation. These daily outbursts, though exhausting, have become so routine that it's easy to lose track of the staggering number of the president's statements that turn out not to be true. Cataloging and recording the number of lies and untruths has literally become a cottage industry for journalists. I happen to be a fan of the Washington Post group called the Fact Checker, but it seems like every news organization now has somebody doing this. So I thought it would be useful just to give a few numbers, a little bit of data journalism here on what we're exactly talking about. According to the Fact Checker, on September 7, President of the United States made 125 false or misleading statements in about 120 minutes of public remarks. That was the new single-day record. The day before, the president had made 74 false or misleading claims, many at a campaign rally in Montana. That day, perhaps not coincidentally, the New York Times had incensed the president by publishing an anonymous op-ed article purportedly by a senior administration official. And just a day earlier, excerpts from Bob Woodward's expose of the Trump White House fear had begun to circulate on the internet. According to the Fact Checker, in the president's first 100 days, he averaged just 4.9 false or misleading claims a day. The historic 5,000th false or misleading claim, for those who like statistics or milestones, was a tweet about the investigation led by special counsel Robert Mueller. Quote, Russian collusion was just an excuse by the Democrats for having lost the election. Now, if you've had the sense in the last few months that the pace of all this is quickening, you would be right. Counting from the inauguration, according to the Post, he was averaging 8.3 false claims per day, but from September 4 to September 13, he reached 32 such falsehoods a day. Now, certainly, previous presidents and previous administrations have lied to the American people about issues big and small. To name a few, Woodrow Wilson ran for president on a platform of keeping the United States out of World War I. That didn't quite work out. The lies of Lyndon Johnson and John F. Kennedy about the Vietnam War fill literally volumes of the Pentagon Papers. Bill Clinton did not have sex with that woman. But to be fair, in both its depth and breadth, the Trump administration's conduct is unprecedented in our history. There's an interesting scene in Bob Woodward's book. It describes a moment when the president's national security advisors have gathered to meet with him in the Oval Office at 10 a.m. on an important issue, which is the question of whether or not transgender people should be allowed to continue serving in the military. Now, his aides have been working on this, and the Pentagon has sent forward, as it typically does, some options, and so they have 4 potential policy choices. And they've told the president to be there at 10. At 8:55, Trump tweets that, quote, after consultation with his experts, he has decided that transgender people will no longer be able to serve in the military. Understandably, pandemonium erupts in the government. None of the experts that the president had been planning to consult were even aware that a decision had been made till the tweet went out. The Pentagon spokesman had literally nothing to say as dozens of reporters began calling to explain how it was all going to work. And the president's spokesman went to the briefing room and insisted that the decision had actually been made days earlier, after Trump had talked with his full national security team. That, in fact, was a lie. She said the Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, had been informed in advance of the decision. That, too, was a lie. In fact, Mattis was on vacation that day in the Pacific Northwest and found out what had happened on his phone. Far from being consulted, Reince Priebus, then the White House Chief of Staff, learned the decision had been made while standing in the Oval Office when his phone beeped with a special tone he had set for presidential tweets. Now, many people have argued in the last year or so that the media should stop writing so much about the tweets and the statements and focus more on what the administration is doing in arenas like environment, financial regulation. Where I'm sitting as an editor, it's not an either-or. When the President of the United States repeatedly says things that are untrue, we in the media have an obligation, if not a duty, to hold him accountable. A president cannot and should not go unchallenged when he insists that hardly anyone died in a hurricane that actually killed thousands of people. Nor should a president be allowed to get away with saying that U.S. Steel is building 6 new plants in the United States when the correct number is 0. And when a president inaccurately attacks our environmental laws by saying, quote, California wildfires are being magnified and made so much worse by the bad environmental laws which aren't allowing massive amounts of readily available water to be utilized, it's being diverted into the Pacific Ocean, we need to say that this is nonsense. But we also need to do a lot more. We need to fully cover what is one of the more significant shifts in government priorities in a generation. At ProPublica, we've tried to put some effort into tracking the actions behind the words. In particular, we focused on how changes in policy are affecting immigrants, veterans, the healthcare system, the oversight of our financial system. All these are important, not to mention the vast number of people being named to the federal courts, changes in environmental rules, changes in the tax code, and the coming debates over how to pay for entitlement programs like Medicare and Medicaid when the budget has been significantly reduced by massive tax cuts. We've also tried to track the extent to which the President has honored his promise to separate the interests of his family business and his role as the nation's chief executive. Now, in each of these arenas, the administration is proposing or considering far-reaching changes. Journalists are providing the independent vetting of what they could mean. And this brings me to my first larger point about our Constitution. As most of us learned in school, our system of government rests on checks and balances. In ordinary circumstances, the Congress and courts serve as a check on the power of the presidency. But in the past 20 months, the Republican-controlled Congress has, in significant measure, been an extension of the White House rather than a check on it. Now, I came up in the 1980s as a young reporter at the New York Times Washington Bureau, and my first assignment, strangely, ironically I suppose, was to compete on the beat covering the CIA and the intelligence agencies against a little-known reporter, Bob Woodward. It wasn't very easy. In 1986, about 3 months onto the beat, the Iran-Contra Affair erupted, and I'm looking around the room. I think I noticed a number of people here who may have been alive during that, although I've discovered when I talk to my staff about the Iran-Contra Affair, I sound like my father talking about the Victrola. So for those who may not recall it, the Reagan White House sold arms to Iran, traded them for some hostages the Iranians were holding, and then sent the proceeds of the arms sales to Nicaragua's Contra rebels, who were then fighting the government of Nicaragua, something that Congress had banned them from doing. When all this came out and it emerged that a White House staff member, Oliver North, actually had his own Swiss bank account, leaders of both parties agreed that there should be a public investigation and hearing into what had happened. Further, the Justice Department appointed a special prosecutor to look into whether crimes were committed. It is difficult to imagine today that Congress would embark on any such enterprise. Now, going back further in history to the Nixon administration, consider this historical fact. The Watergate break-in occurred on June 17, 1972. Richard Nixon was elected in a landslide in November of 1972. We've all seen, or many of us, I suppose, have seen the movie All the President's Men, or perhaps read the book by Woodward and Bernstein. That Woodward just keeps coming up. And so we know there was a lot of reporting by the Washington Post that was mostly ignored by other newspapers, including, to its great regret, my friends at the New York Times. But But I think sometimes it's forgotten that despite the courage and daring do of Woodward and Bernstein, the Watergate story was significantly broken by the Congress and the FBI. In point of fact, by February of 1973, which is just 6 or 7 months after the Watergate break-in, the Senate voted 77-0 to create the Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities, which is better known as the Senate Watergate Committee. I'm not sure what resolution today's Senate could pass 77-0. Maybe something about motherhood? Apple pie? Baseball? I don't know. In Watergate, Congress, the FBI, and the special prosecutor played crucial roles. Perhaps the most important moment in the entire case was the revelation that the president had installed a secret taping system that had recorded nearly all of his conversations. It's worth remembering how that all came to light. On July 13, 1973, aides in the Senate committee, the Senate Watergate Committee, called in an obscure former White House official, Alexander Butterfield, who does have one claim to historical fame. He was the person at the White House who actually oversaw the installation of the microphones and the taping system. Butterfield did not want to tell the committee about this, but he wouldn't lie. So when he was asked a direct question, did Nixon have any recording devices other than his dictaphone? That's right up there with Victrola. Yes, a device that turned recorded sound into tape. Butterfield felt he had no choice but to tell the truth. Before it was over, the special prosecutor would subpoena those tapes, the Supreme Court would rule the president couldn't withhold them, and the end of the Nixon presidency was brought on by the so-called smoking gun tape, in which he could be clearly heard organizing the cover-up of Watergate. Today, of course, there is no congressional committee publicly examining the role Russia played in the 2016 presidential election. If there is an Alexander Butterfield lurking somewhere in the background, it's a fair guess that he or she won't come to light as a result of a congressional inquiry, and certainly not one with a bipartisan staff. The main engines of the Russia inquiry so far have been the press and the special counsel, Robert Mueller, whose work has been conducted almost entirely in secret. And so the public's understanding of this important issue remains largely clouded, both because of its complexity and because so much of the information is in the hands of prosecutors whose disclosures to the public come in indictments, trials, and court filings. Our Constitution clearly intended for members of Congress to keep a skeptical eye on the executive branch. And oversight of the government's agencies and of the White House is an essential aspect of that oversight. Right now, it's not happening, and the traditional role of oversight, for better or worse, has fallen to the media. Not surprisingly, the president would prefer that reporters take the same relatively docile approach as the House and Senate committees. In fact, it is the journalists who are now providing some of the toughest, most probing oversight of the Trump administration. And I do believe it's a large part of the reason for President Trump's incessant rhetoric about reporters as enemies of the people. With congressional oversight largely absent, the president has significant incentive to discredit the last remaining source of skepticism about his policies and pronouncements. Parenthetically, I should say, it's pretty clear that Trump and his supporters do see some political benefit from trolling the libs. They see, and they're right, that their base is invigorated when he shouts at rallies and tweets that journalists are terrible people bent on making up stories and so on. And it's also no coincidence, if you chart these things, that the cries of fake news intensify as the media uncovers unflattering details about, say, former EPA Secretary Scott Pruitt's attempts to use his government job to get both cheap rent and a position for his wife at a lobbying firm. Last year, my organization, which does not yet have an official name, we're not the failing ProPublica, we don't have a nickname, but we did get some honor. We were publicly dismissed by the hardly lamented at all Sean Spicer as a left-wing blog. And by the way, I should say, left wing is nonsense, but that blog thing hurt, right? I mean, blog? You know how much time we spend on these stories? Really? Blog? That was painful. But why were we called? Why were we, dismissed this way? Well, we had accurately reported that President Trump had changed his trust agreement so that he could take out money from any of his foreign businesses without making any public report of doing so. In some ways, this is a little bit familiar for me. Earlier in my career, I had the fun of being a foreign correspondent and then a war correspondent, and I covered a totalitarian country ruled by a one-party state. Journalism is probably much more to President Trump's liking. The nightly newscasts consisted of fawning accounts of how the great leader spent his day, which usually involved meetings with visiting dignitaries. The front pages of the newspapers carried not a whiff of criticism, even when the regime was being lambasted by nations throughout the world for war crimes. Such indeed was every day in Slobodan Milosevic's Serbia. Trump's media preferences seem to me to have some similarity to Milosevic's. He loves Sean Hannity and programs like Fox and Friends, and broadcasts that ceaselessly praise his stable genius. Anything else is fake news. He speaks enviously of autocrats who rule countries with an entirely controlled press, see North Korea, or a largely controlled press, China. The anonymous official who dared write an op-ed criticizing his ignorance and short attention span was guilty of no less than treason, and he demanded that the New York Times immediately turn them in. Surprisingly, the Times did not comply with this request, and he then demanded that the Justice Department use its full powers of law enforcement to track down the identity of the author. Invoking a very favorite excuse of dictators worldwide, he said such an investigation was appropriate and legal because the presence of a critic within his inner council was a matter of national security. Then he reiterated the idea, first raised during the presidential campaign, that someone, somewhere, should open up, close quote, the libel laws, so it would be easier to go after authors like Bob Woodward. And this is a second important point to reflect on Constitution Day. It is highly unlikely that Trump is going to succeed in opening up our libel laws. The American approach to libel is based on the constitutional protections of the First Amendment, and it cannot be overturned by an executive order or even a vote of Congress. The only way to reduce the freedom of press in our country is to rewrite the Constitution. And fortunately, the Founding Fathers made that unbelievably difficult. Now, I don't want to sound complacent about the solidity of America's legal approach to press freedom, which, by the way, is, from the perspective of a card-carrying member of the enemy of the people up here, the greatest legal regimen you could ever imagine for covering politicians and important people. I should say, as a small aside, that I learned about the sort of incredible power and depth of our press protections when I was an editor at the New York Times, and we did an investigation in Mexico in which we accused a governor of a major Mexican state and a rising member of the ruling party of having connections to drug dealers. And he then filed a criminal case against our reporters. And I said, I said to our lawyer, what does Mexican libel law consist of? What makes a libel? What's the crime? And he says, I had this translated from Spanish. It says, insulting the dignity of a public official. I said, how many years can you get for that? He said, up to 5. So we obviously don't have such laws. In point of fact, for students of colonial history, it's interesting, Britain did have at that time a law called seditious libel, where you could be put in jail for things you published or said about the king. And it was an important first step in our Constitution to make sure we did not have such a system. And the First Amendment owes its roots to that. Now, I have to say, I thought that the sort of protection of the press in the First Amendment was something that had existed forever. But Professor Lee Bollinger at Columbia has written some fascinating things on this, and he points out that no, in fact, the first decision the Supreme Court ever did on press freedom in the First Amendment actually came as late as 1919. And I got to say, it wasn't a great ruling. The question at issue was, Eugene V. Debs, an American socialist, had given some speeches in about 1917 which violated the Espionage Act, which had been passed that year as we were going into war with Germany. And under the Espionage Act, it was illegal to question America's participation in World War I. That was a crime. That was a criminal offense. And Debs was duly charged, and ultimately the case went to the Supreme Court, and wait for it now because you're hoping the court is going to say, don't be ridiculous. Actually, the court ruled 9-0 that this was constitutional. Eugene V. Debs was hustled off to a federal prison where he sat for the next 2.5 years. By the way, another weird historical aside, while sitting in the prison, he ran for president again and notched up 1 million votes in the 1920 election. And I guess in perhaps a reversal of lock her up, President Warren G. Harding, a well-known paragon of ethics, commuted his sentence and sent Mr. Debs to his freedom after having served 2.5 years for speech. I should say, by the way, the Espionage Act was ultimately struck down by the court, but that's another story. So it really isn't until much later that the Supreme Court begins its landmark rulings that open up freedom of the press, and of course the famous Times v. Sullivan, which is the basis of all current libel law, holds that if you are writing about a public figure, and that can be a politician, that can be a businessman, that can be an athlete, it is, first of all, you have, as in all libel cases, the defense of truth. You say the story is true, and you're not going to go be sued or have to pay any damages. But in the case of public figures, it goes much further. In order to open up the possibility of a press questioning the powerful, the Supreme Court said there should be greater license for mistakes. That is to say, if an article about a public figure contains errors, it is still not libelous unless those errors were made deliberately or with what they called actual malice. And these are very important concepts in our country. This is the bulwark of our press freedom. And actual malice means that the journalists, the organization, set out either knowing something was false and they wrote it, or wrote it with such reckless disregard for the truth that no reasonable person could say that they had taken appropriate precautions. And this is the cornerstone of our constitutional protections of the activities of the enemies of the people. Where Trump has made progress in his attacks on the press is what might term the court of public opinion. By using the bully pulpit of the presidency and his Twitter, and by deploying his unquestionably well-attuned skills for demagoguery, he has made millions and millions of our fellow citizens question the truth of most of what they hear and read. In perhaps his most Orwellian moment, he told a rally recently, "Don't believe that crap you see from those people, the fake news." Now, I remind you, for those who haven't read 1984 recently, there's a line in there that says, "Just remember, what you are seeing and what you are reading is not what's happening." Now, in what he said, "Don't believe the crap you see from these people," Trump is cleverly taking aim at a true conundrum in journalism and in our daily lives. It is actually difficult, I would say impossible, to create a complete, fully accurate account of events in real time. Errors of interpretation, omission, accuracy, fact are pretty much inevitable when we are writing very rough drafts of history in a matter of minutes, if not hours. Those mistakes can and will be seized on by politicians determined to discredit their critics in journalism or bury information that undermine their policies. Now, I often do a little audience participation number at this point with journalism students. I'd like to try it here. Could the people in the auditorium who have ever read or seen a television story about a subject they actually knew well raise their hands? How many people in this room have had journalism done in the general vicinity of them? I can't really see out there. I assume there are some. Okay, now, lower your hands if you didn't think it was fully accurate? Wow. I don't think I see any hands. Oh, there's one in the back, thank God. Usually when you do this with journalism students, all but about 2 of the hands go down. And then, of course, as a journalist or a journalism student, you say to yourself, well, they weren't talking about one of my stories. I don't make those kind of mistakes, but of course you do. Many years ago, when I was a reporter covering the Pentagon for the New York Times Washington Bureau, I had the great pleasure of sitting next to a retired Marine Corps general who had been hired by the New York Times to work as its military correspondent. And he sat next to me for weeks and weeks, and we got to be good friends. And after listening to me work the phones, one day he just looked at me and he said, when I used to read all those stories that were way off base, I thought it was that you guys were just lazy. I had no idea you were working this hard to get it as wrong as you do. Now, the reasons for failing to get it right the first time are many. First of all, the people involved in the events we're trying to describe do frequently offer self-serving accounts of what's happening. Sometimes they are just lying, known in Washington as spin. Sometimes they're just mistaken. They heard something from somebody who heard it from somebody else, and they didn't bother to tell you that it wasn't first-hand information. One of the first 2 words I learned in covering the war in Yugoslavia, I would come to a village and they would say something happened, and I would say, samo oche, only eyes. Please tell me what you saw. And usually that meant very little. They didn't see much at all, but they'd heard a lot. Most journalism relies on asking people what they saw or what they heard, and then trying to assemble an account that approximates the truth. And again, even when we're trying, very few of us are what I would describe as perfectly reliable sources. Just ask anyone, if you can imagine such a thing, who's had an argument with a spouse, child, or family member. Ask them who had the definitive account of what was said. In fact, beyond that, everyone brings a perspective to the events they experience. The biases in how you remember things can be personal. I like this person. Therefore, I'm going to subconsciously edit what I heard to make it more consistent with my overall view of them. Bias also arises from viewpoint. I agree with this person, so I'm going to remember their argument and what they said as being less offensive than it actually was because I agree with what they were really saying. That's eyewitness bias. And then there's plenty of unconscious and conscious bias among the observers, the journalists. Now, different cultures in the world have different ways of dealing with the problem of bias among journalists. In Europe, the slanting of news reporting is considered completely inevitable. So most outlets have a political framework into which they fit reporting. The job of the publications is to make crystal clear which side they favor so that readers can make the appropriate judgments as they read the stories. American journalism actually began much the same way, with newspapers divided by political affiliation and viewpoint for most of the first 150 years of our existence. But over the past century or so, what one might call the mainstream media set out to do something more delicate and more difficult: report the news in ways that is fair, accurate, and free of discernible bias. That does turn out to be quite complicated, because if we're honest with ourselves, we have to acknowledge that everyone, editor, reporter, everyone who is doing news, reporting, and work has a framework for seeing the world that arises from their background, cultural experiences, and upbringing. At ProPublica, our mission statement says that we will, and I quote, expose abuses of power and betrayals of the public trust by government, business, and other institutions using the moral force of investigative journalism to spur reform through the sustained spotlighting of wrongdoing. That's a mouthful, isn't it? If we at ProPublica are honest, we would have to say that nobody can draft a clear, absolute, specific definition of what constitutes an abuse of power or a betrayal of the public trust. We like to say, I suppose, we know it when we see it. But what determines what we know and what we see, if not our own biases? Then, of course, there is the problem of MSNBC and Fox News. Both have made commercial decisions to be more like European publications, with Fox taking the role of state television and MSNBC the loyal or maybe not so loyal, opposition. The rise of polarized media, which parallels the rise of a polarized nation, deepens the problem for journalists still trying to play it straight. So where does that leave us? To my eye, the constitutional bulwarks that protect a free press are frayed, but they're still holding. On the other hand, signs of our increasing polarization are everywhere, and they're worrying. Recently, a national poll found that 43% of people who identified as Republicans said they believe the president should have the authority to close news outlets engaged in bad behavior. Only 36% of self-identified Republicans disagreed with that statement. This view of the press, to be fair and clear, is not restricted to a single party or ideological perspective. That very same survey found that 12% of Democrats and 21% of independents said they agreed the president should have the authority to close news outlets engaged in bad behavior. Nonetheless, for all of its shortcomings, I continue to be an optimist about our democracy. Personally, I'm not a fan of the Electoral College and its propensity to award the presidency to candidates who lose the popular vote. I think the ability of political parties in states to engage in gerrymandering that can change outcomes is a flaw that might be better addressed. And certainly, our institutions are under stress. But they've been under stress before in our history. And we've always found a way to swing the pendulum back. So I'd like to conclude, and I hope take questions and have a lively discussion with a paraphrase of Winston Churchill. Yes, our Constitution is the worst form of government, except for all the others.
Thank you so much. He's on. For those who'd like to ask questions, we ask that you come forward, but I'm going to take provost's privilege and ask the first question, which is, we are tasked with helping our students develop a skill to perhaps parse the different news outlets, right? And you have told us in a very clear way that you're going to make mistakes, which we understand. What guidance would you give us to help them get past the headline to the next question?
Well, that's a great question. I think one of the things that a news consumer can demand today of a news outlet is transparency, which is to say, when statements are made in a story or a report, I think you as the reader have a right to see where they come from. Who's talking? Are there documents? The internet has unlimited amounts of space and ability for people in the journalism business to share the sources of their information. And so I think step one in looking at a journalism outlet is, are they clear and transparent and expansive in telling you where things come from? A second thing to look at in thinking about news outlets is, do they ever admit mistakes? I mean, as I said in this talk, the mistakes are inevitable. It isn't true that reporters like Bob Woodward or people on my staff sit around making things up and dreaming up stories and inventing characters, but there will be mistakes. That doesn't mean that the news is fake news, but it means that there may be things that are wrong. And I think it's fair to ask as a consumer of news, well, what do they do when it's wrong? Do they ever correct things? How do they correct things? You know, we made a major mistake at ProPublica on a story, and we ran a 1,000-word explanation of what was wrong, why it was wrong, and why what was wrong and what we did was significant. That's not something I was very happy about. I would have been much happier not to make the mistake, and I probably would have been happier not to have to go that far, but I feel that we owe our audience a full-throated explanation when things go wrong, because we expect the government to explain when things go wrong and to be honest about it, and if we can't do that ourselves, then I question why we would have credibility. So I think those are kind of starting points, you know, and I would say, you know, we are increasingly close to that situation in Europe where you need to read multiple outlets to make sure that you're getting a full perspective on what your fellow citizens think and on what they're seeing.
Good evening. Thanks very much for your thoughts. I truly appreciate them. I have two questions this evening. The first is that I would suggest that the mainstream media made Mr. Trump. And the reason I state that is going back to the early parts of his campaign, they were just clamoring for a soundbite to get him on TV. He played them like a fiddle, and I never heard them challenging any of the outrageous claims that he made then. And because of that tremendous coverage that he had, that led him to where we are today. The second, well, I'd like to see what response you have to that. The second question, I believe you said that the president has 54 million Twitter followers. If we discount the bots and the handful that are well-rounded, I'll take a wag that there were perhaps 40 million people in this country that get all their news from Twitter or Fox News. 100% of their news coverage is from that. And they're seeing what I would say is a very biased opinion of what's going on, but they have no reason to disbelieve it, to fact check it. Unfortunately, I think a lot of the 40 million are probably armed, and armed heavily. If it gets to the point of the president being challenged, impeached, whatever happens, will there be some violent uprising caused by them? And I'd like to hear what you have to say about that. Thank you.
Sure. Those are two very good questions. To the first question, I would agree completely that the coverage of Trump during the campaign was not sufficiently skeptical. You know, there was a kind of snarky statement that said, you know, that the problem is the press is taking him literally but not seriously, whereas the people take him seriously but not literally. Actually, to give credit where credit is due, almost everything that Trump said that people found outlandish during the campaign, he's attempted to do. So that critique of, well, why would you take him seriously? This is all just trolling the libs. Actually, he announced his policies and he has done his very level-headed best to carry them out. So I think that is a very, very fair critique of the 2016 coverage. You know, there was a sort of deep belief in America that he couldn't possibly win. And to some extent, you know, this was underscored by what I would say is a misunderstanding of basic statistics and data journalism. People kept looking at these various things online, the New York Times and others, and said, well, gee, he only has a 1 in 4 chance, so there's a 75% chance that Hillary Clinton's going to be the president. That may well have been true, but for those of you who follow baseball, 1 for 4 is 250 and it's a professional contract. So lots of people, you know, can make a living going 1 for 4, and Donald Trump became president in a 1 in 4 chance. So that's the first point. As to the second, yeah, I think there is increasing polarization in our country. I don't, or at least I hope, that if the president ultimately leaves office, either 4 years from now or sooner, and my bet is on 4 years from now at the minimum, I don't think that ultimately that you're going to see 67 senators push out Donald Trump. But if that were to happen, I'd like to think our country is stronger than the suggestion that we're going to have an armed uprising. But, you know, look, I'm a journalist, and so far the journalist's ability to predict anything about the future has been exactly zero, so don't believe me.
Hi. In your speech, you mentioned how President Trump's approach to the media is similar in some ways to the repressive governments you've covered in the past. Earlier this year, Senator Flake, the Republican from Arizona, said that Trump's approach to the press emboldens repressive governments to restrict freedom of the press. And since his campaign and election, leaders like Bashar al-Assad and leaders in Myanmar and Duterte in the Philippines have either borrowed some of his language like fake news or outright cited Donald Trump's approach to the press for their reasoning why they can change the way press is allowed to be covered in their government. I was wondering what you think that we can do to protect the nations that we stand as a example of democracy and press as we move forward through, as you said, we have a bulwark of press protections here in America, but we have an echo effect around the world.
Yeah, I wish I could offer some sort of clear path. I do think there are some very fine organizations like Committee to Protect Journalists. If you're not familiar with their work, I think they do some fine work around the world trying to pressure governments to not do their worst to local journalists. But I do believe, yes, absolutely, that this kind of behavior by our president has emboldened people around the world to do things they might not otherwise do. And you mentioned Myanmar. The country recently jailed 2 Reuters journalists for 7 years for reporting on the massacre of the Rohingya. And the silence from the American government is deafening. And I believe that if, the one-time human rights activist Aung San Suu Kyi would have a different viewpoint if the United States government were saying today, look, you got to free these people or you're not going to get any more aid. And that's not what's happening. I don't think there's been a single word about this from the American government, and it is absolutely outrageous. Any other questions? Oh, there must be a few more.
So I wonder what you think the effect of the decline of local journalism has on the way you're interpreting this challenge for journalists.
Yeah, the decline of local journalism is something that's being much talked about in our field. You do see at the national level, new organizations like Politico, BuzzFeed, us, Marshall Project. There is some amount of philanthropic support and even, frankly, at this point, some commercial support. The New York Times is making more money than it has in many years since November of 2016. So I think the national level is pretty good. We are seeing devastating cuts in journalists at the local level, and these jobs are not being replaced. The funding has gone away, and frankly, as a citizen, I worry a lot about that. I'm not sure what the direct connection is between our politics and the lack of local journalism, but I feel confident there is a connection, and I think we're really losing something. And we're not just losing something when it comes to who you vote for president, we're losing something about who on earth holds accountable the local city government. The Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting a few years back went to the Los Angeles Times for a story they did in a community named Bell, California. Bell, California had lost its local newspaper about 10 years ago, and so literally no one attended the city council meetings. And so the town manager and the members of the city council decided it would be really cool to vote themselves some really big salaries. City manager was earning $986,000 a year with 37 weeks annually of vacation paid. I kid you not. And it took more than a year for anyone to find out about this. In fact, it took several years. I mean, everybody ended up going to jail. And, the question I always had about the LA Times Pulitzer, which was certainly well earned, but the Bell, California was less than an hour's drive from their newsroom. So is this a success or a failure? And you got to ask yourself right now, as these newspapers are disappearing across the country, state after state, city after city, state house after state house, to what extent, are there Bell Californias dotting the whole country? And I think the answer is there are certainly more than we know about. At ProPublica, we've launched a program where we've gotten some donors to give us money. We're now funding investigative projects as of next year in 14 newsrooms across the country. We pay for a full-time reporter to work in those newsrooms, working on a year-long project. So we're trying, in our little way, but that's a drop in a very large bucket, and the bucket is getting bigger and bigger every year.
You mentioned transparency, and for us to trust the media, I was wondering how you felt about anonymous sources and unnamed authors, and also knowing the difference between news and commentary when people have commentary masquerading as news.
Yeah, I think these raise two significant questions. One of the ways that you get attention on the internet is by writing a kind of a hot take or an analysis. And so when the internet sort of culture took off, a lot of writing about politics became kind of snarky and edgy and opinionated, and it got a lot of clicks. And I think people who write straight news, were sort of inextricably pulled toward being, showing a little bit more attitude and a little bit more edge. I think that's very dangerous. I think we do not want our news coverage to have those values. I think it needs to be straight and precise and careful. And there is a kind of an inevitable gravitational pull of this sort of other style of writing, which, my colleagues and I as editors, we all talk about, the sort of sense that people writing today who want to be read feel that there's a certain style that they should aspire to. And, at least in the news world, it's a bad idea. I was asked by, earlier on, students a very good question about the anonymous op-ed and what did I think of it. On the one hand, anonymous sources are a legitimate and important way to report certain kinds of news. If we want to know what is happening in the world of national security and intelligence, and sometimes we do, the reporters are going to have to use unnamed sources because anyone who attaches their name to a secret is going to go to jail for the rest of their lives. So we're not going to have any journalism about certain subjects like torture or surveillance of Americans or things that we would all care about without anonymous sources. What the New York Times, Washington Post, and other places would say is that when it comes to using things that are not factual, a source said the president is a moron, that would be called anonymous pejorative, that is unacceptable in the news columns. That is not a proper use of anonymous sources. That would be called, we used to call that anonymous pejorative. And it was theoretically banned when I worked at the New York Times. Not always banned, because sometimes it would get in and then you'd get a nasty note from the top editor. But you really weren't supposed to do that. Now, the op-ed page has a different set of standards. I mean, they run pejorative things all the time. They run columns. So it wasn't a big stretch for the New York Times op-ed page to run an anonymously pejorative thing. But I think it's very problematical. And I think the biggest problem with it is it better be a very senior official. Because if it comes out, as I think it will at some point, who this is, and that person turns out to be, the left-handed third assistant secretary at the State Department or whatever, that's not going to go well. If it's Mike Pence, I guess I will say it's good that they ran that. But I don't think it is Mike Pence, by the way, despite Lodestar.
First of all, full disclosure, I used to be a reporter for a long time in a
So
local
you're a
newspaper.
recovering reporter?
Well, and I think that the question that I have a couple of questions, and they're kind of complex. And they're difficult questions because I think you're going to think that I'm putting you on the spot. But I think that the issue with the distrust of the U.S. media goes long before Donald Trump. And for example, there's been some considerable discussion in the alternative media, which has been completely classified as this conspiracy theorist media, which is unfair. There have been some really good independent journalists. And there have been some really good uses of independent journalism, for example, to talk about, for example, the CIA involvement in news media, Operation Mockingbird or Project Mockingbird. So that doesn't get a lot of widespread attention. So I wanted to ask you about that. What you think about that, where the CIA actually had in 1975 acknowledged during these church hearings that they did have assets in the New York Times and other major media to make sure that stories were written that were going to be sympathetic to a particular cause. So that's one question. And also you did mention Woodrow Wilson and his lying about the war, but that's been an ongoing kind of way that U.S. government can get people who don't want to go to war. And I think the most recent example is the invasion of Iraq. And of course, we could talk about what happened before with Persian Gulf, that was a Hill and Knowlton public relations campaign to get people to be sympathetic. So, to say that Donald Trump is really kind of generating this distrust, I think it's become much more publicly discussed that there's a distrust of media, but I think, can you respond to, these other very real, significant happenings over the last 50 years that have made a lot of people, regardless of whether they support Trump or not, very skeptical about what the media puts out as information?
Yeah, it's interesting, by the way, because I thought you were going to go in a slightly different direction, but I'll start with the direction you went in. I think there's lots of reason to mistrust the media. I think that what we have seen again and again is that the media is quite frequently behind the reality, you know? And to go to the question of the CIA, absolutely yes. In 1975, the Congress held bipartisan hearings on the misconduct of the CIA, and they did in fact have, as they would put it, assets within the American media. That's absolutely true and worrying. I will point out to you, however, that the program didn't go perfectly because the person who broke the story that led to the Church Committee was one Seymour Hersh, who wrote the story for the New York Times. So whatever they had in terms of ability to control the New York Times, it didn't go all that well because ultimately, you know, Cy's story blew the whole thing up and caused the creation of the Congressional Oversight Committees. So that was, I think, a reasonably good impact by the media, Cy, of course, being the guy who broke the My Lai story. So I think it is possible for you know, there to be people who build distrust in the media, and I think those are fair points, but there are also, you know, some things on the other side. But I think, look, we've missed, you know, an awful lot of stories over the years. You know, the Iraq example is a good one. You know, I mean, there was a sort of a drumbeat of war created by the Bush administration, and by and large, the New York Times, the Washington Post, you know, smart people were willing to publish things that were not verified and that ended up not being true. So I don't think that the sort of media's credibility problem, if you will, is necessarily all the fault of Donald Trump, and I certainly didn't mean to suggest that it was, because, you know, I think there is, as I try to suggest in what I was saying here, there are plenty of times where, you know, the media has not fully reported things because they weren't thinking about things in the way that they should have been.
So can I ask one more question?
Please do.
So what's the solution? How do you start to get away from public relations officials who seem to control what journalists are printing? I mean, I worked in a newsroom. You didn't write a story unless you dealt with public relations people. And of course, that's also happening at these higher levels. So what's the solution?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, this is a great question about sort of the fact that your tax dollars actually pay for people to be so-called spokesmen for government agencies who then stand up and tell lies. And what do we do about that? And, you know, I mean, I think that I hope and I try when I'm training young reporters now and when I employ reporters that I employ people whose first step is to ignore, avoid, and go around the public relations people. I mean, I recently got a phone call from a very angry person in the Immigration Service who said, "Your reporter is calling our people, and they're not going through proper channels, they're not talking to the spokesman. And what do you think about that?" And I said, "Ma'am, I'm delighted." So they're calling them on the cell phones. I said, "Yes, I'm sure they are." "Some of them are even seeing people at their homes." "Yes, I'm sure they are." "What are you going to do about it?" I said, "Encourage them." You know, and so, I mean, I guess there is still perhaps some hope or expectation that reporters will take what they're fed. And I will tell you that when I started as a reporter, I had a belief, kind of crazy, I had a belief that if you called up a paid public affairs spokesman for a government agency and you asked them a direct question and you were on the record with them, they wouldn't lie to you. Okay, I was a little naive, and one day I started covering the CIA beat. It was my very, very first story, and it was about a Russian who defected to the United States and started pointing out various Americans who were spies in the government. And I called up the chief spokesman for the CIA and I said, "George, this is what I'm saying tomorrow." And he said, "We can't discuss defectors." And I said, "George, I'm going to read you these sentences. I don't want to hear anything tomorrow. This is your chance." And he said, "We have no comment." And the next day he issued a statement that said the story in today's New York Times is untrue. And that was a lie.
Thank you.
Sure.
So first, I'd like to say thank you. Let's give a nice round of applause for our speaker.